Hello, I'm Alex Pagnani, a member of the Our Lady of the Presentation parish, and today it's my pleasure to speak a little on Catholic social teaching. I'm not a theologian, and I don't claim to speak for the Church, but during my years at Notre Dame, I took several courses on the topic, and they had a great effect on me. Since that time, I've continued to grow in my study of God's Church, particularly in its rich history and the practical application of its social teachings to the modern world. I'm pleased to share some of that interest with you today. Before we talk about anything at all, it's pretty important to make sure we're on the same page about what that thing is. Catholic social teaching, or CST for short, is a body of principles and guidelines that the Church has developed over centuries in order to make its members more prudent and authentically Catholic when they make decisions in their public lives. In a way, the teachings try to answer the question, I'm a Catholic, so now what? They're meant to be supportive teachings that help us each to take our faith and apply it to the world around us, where the rubber hits the road. The body of teachings primarily derive from a collection of papal encyclicals on social topics that have been written over the past 3 centuries. In the 1800s, these encyclicals tended to focus on the rights and treatments of workers in an increasingly industrialized world. In the 1900s, the Cold War shifted the focus to teachings on our political rights and responsibilities. In the 2000s, we've already seen Pope Francis contribute with a stronger emphasis on humanity's responsibility to care for the planet and all of God's creation. Different popes have emphasized these elements of social life a little bit differently over the centuries. But what has gradually emerged is a meaningful and substantive collection of teachings that have already had significant impacts on global politics and on the idea of human rights. Now, in one sense, Catholic social teaching has been taught through papal encyclicals. But that's not to say that the popes made it up. The social teachings of our faith come from much deeper and more authoritative sources, being God's expressed desire for our lives, along with one of the Bible's earliest teachings of who humans even are. The next time you attend a baptism, listen carefully to the words of the priest. You'll hear him baptize the child as priest, prophet, and king. It's God's desire that we each live all of these roles to the fullest. As priests, we are meant to follow in the footsteps of the high priest, Jesus Christ, and to participate fully in the worship of God. Think of the amount of call and response during Mass. The priest says one thing, we respond with another, then we join our voices in prayer or song. Mass is a communal, public worship, and we all play a vital role in that. Okay, so what about being a prophet? Well, the world these days is a pretty upside down place. But if we're going to be honest, it's always been a pretty upside down place. One of my favorite religious quotes comes from the Catholic author G.K. Chesterton, who quipped that original sin is the only part of Christianity that can really be proved. After all, he said, all you have to do is look around and you're going to see people doing all sorts of bad things anywhere you look. So what do we do about that? Well, our baptismal call to be a prophet says what? We are each called to proclaim the gospel loudly, to call out injustice when we see it, to work to pull the world and its people back away from sin and back to the way that God wants us to live. Now, if you do that well enough, people are going to think you're crazy, and that's okay, because folks in the Old Testament pretty much thought the same thing of their prophets, so you'll be in good company. And that brings us to the third call, to be a king, which is really the most important here when we're talking about Catholic social teaching. When you read the Bible and you look at the lives of the Hebrew kings, it's pretty strongly emphasized that a good king does 2 things. First, a good king serves, Now, Christ is the perfect example of that, isn't he? And second, a good king protects his people. The king is strong, the people are weak. They rely on him to serve and protect, or else they know that their lives are going to fall apart. Now, we may not have a king, but don't we want our leaders and those in authority now to do the same thing? Don't we want them to serve and protect us? Drawing from that, Catholic social teaching is going to push us on those questions of how we can serve those around us and how we can protect the marginalized in society. That brings us to probably the single most important source of Catholic social teaching and many other things. It's one of the very earliest teachings of the Bible that God created men and women in the image and likeness of God. It seems like such a simple phrase. You'd be forgiven for just sort of passing over it and thinking, that's nice. But it is anything but simple. It is a truth that lies at the very core of much of what comes later with church philosophy and theology. After all, if God is the ultimate reality, the ultimate truth, the ultimate beauty, the ultimate perfection, etc., and we were created like him, that's going to carry a lot of weight. So let's dwell on it for a moment. What does it mean to really be created in God's own image? What does God do that we've been created with the power to do as well? Well, the Catechism identifies 5 things in particular that would be good to pay attention to. The first is that we have a spiritual, immortal soul and are designed not just for 70 years or so on this planet, but rather as creatures who will live for all eternity. Like God, we have been given immortal life. Second, unlike the animals, we have the ability to truly and deeply reason. We're capable of complex logic, deep philosophy, and we have the ability to engage on a real, meaningful search for truth. If we're made with those kinds of intense mental powers, well, while they pale in comparison, of course, to God's omnipotence, we still do get to have a tiny taste, don't we? Third, we have the ability to freely choose things. Cows and chickens don't have free will. We, on the other hand, we are able to use some of that reasoning previously mentioned and to decide what we think we should do when there's a difficult choice to be made. The importance of free will cannot be understated because in addition to letting us choose to become the greatest of saints, it also allows us to choose to become the worst of sinners. Why would God give us such a dangerous gift? Because he wants us to choose to love him freely, without force, without coercion, and because he knows that for reasons pretty much beyond our comprehension at times, that the risks are apparently worth it. Fourth, humans are fundamentally social. As the old saying goes, no man is an island. We don't do well on our own, do we? We become lonely when we're by ourselves for extended periods of time. We become depressed. We might even become a little bit unhinged. That's why we use solitary confinement as a punishment, not a reward, right? Now, the surprising fact that most people never realize is that God is inherently social as well. In his very essence, as Christ revealed, he has a nature of being triune, 3 in 1, 3 persons in one being. As those relationships exist and always have and always will with God, he is, by his own nature and definition, social. And that was given to us when we were created in his image. Fifth, if God is the height of all perfection and worthy of all glory and all praise, and we are created in his image, there is an awful lot to infer there about our own self-worth. God is inherently sacred, so are we. God is inherently valuable, so are we. He's inherently dignified, so are we. As some people have put it, the holiest thing you will ever see in your existence is God. The second holiest thing is other people. Now that we know that Catholic social teaching is a body of church teachings about how we are to live and interact in a very social world, and that these teachings derive from our baptismal callings and our creation in the image and likeness of God, it's time to ask where the rubber hits the road. Modern CST is typically grouped around 7 main pillars, each of which is a major teaching that addresses key aspects on how we are called to live our lives. Being social, you're going to see that these teachings do affect many issues that we would consider to be deeply political. It's important to remember, though, that the church is not a political organization and its goals are not to promote either rightist or leftist views. The church's job is to speak truth and help us to understand how that truth should shape our thoughts and actions. As a side note, one thing you're going to notice as we go through these principles is that not only do they not fit with or support one American political party over the other, but that they really promote a mix of views from across the political spectrum. As a result, a lot of American Catholics, including myself, can feel stuck in the middle at times politically. Now, that's a topic for another day. But one interesting side note is that following the devastation in World War II, a number of European political thinkers began to reevaluate the question of how they could structure society and political life and take a new approach. And one of the ideas that emerged was that perhaps a better society and a better world could be created if it was built upon Catholic social teaching and Lutheran ideals. As a result, throughout Europe, South America, a number of other countries, you have what are known as Christian Democrat parties. And these are usually not fringe parties, they're usually pretty mainstream. And these Christian Democrat parties are actually a legacy of that tradition. And instead of using a elephant or a donkey to represent themselves, you typically see Christian Democrat parties using the image below or one like it. It's an image of the hound of heaven bringing light to the world. I like that. So, the first pillar of Catholic social teaching is that all humans possess inherent dignity and are worthy of infinite love and respect. If we are each created in the image and likeness of God, then none of us are worthless. None of us are disposable. And none of us deserve anything less than infinite love and infinite forgiveness from each other. That's a heavy one. Let that sink in. You possess infinite value, and you can never lose your infinite dignity, and you will always be worthy of infinite love. That probably makes you feel pretty good, doesn't it? Makes me feel pretty good. But let's keep digging a little bit with a simple twist. Everybody else is the same as you in that respect. Isn't that great? Well, that's everybody else from the greatest saint to the worst sinner, right? Being made in the image and likeness of God actually means that we are all worthy of respect because of who we are, not because of what we do. Even the person who has hurt you the most in your life is still worthy of infinite respect and possesses infinite value and infinite dignity and deserves infinite forgiveness because of who they are, being created in the image and likeness of God. Does Christ's commandment to love your enemies make a little bit more sense in that context? The other huge understanding we need to take away from this pillar is this. If every single human being is inherently valuable and worthy of respect, then life must be protected at every stage from ideas that would devalue it or view it as a commodity. The life present at the moment of conception is of infinite value and importance, no less than mine, no less than yours. The lives of the profoundly disabled or the most mentally or physically struggling individuals are no less dignified and no less valuable than any other human who ever lived on this planet. And the sanctity of human life also must be prevented until its very final moments, until a natural death. The second pillar of Catholic social teaching is the call to build a just society, and there is a lot to unpack in this one. After all, if we're all created in the image and likeness of God, what sort of world would we need to create to reflect that? Papal encyclicals have been clear on many related points. First, that every human being has a right to be an active participant in their social life and in their own political governance. Second, that families and communities should form the building blocks of society, working together to make decisions at the local level. Third, that one of the central goals of human life is to promote human flourishing. In other words, to help yourself and to help others to be the best possible selves we could ever be, and in fact, to support each other on our journeys to heaven. The social lives that we must build in our community have to reflect these goals at all times. Fourth, we are taught that one of the major ways we can seek to promote the flourishing of all people is to actively fight against racism, sexism, classism, and any other form of exclusion or marginalization that would deny human flourishing. Lastly, that these decisions about how to structure society and seek justice should always be made at the lowest possible level of government, a principle known as subsidiarity, in order to respect self-governance and political participation. The third pillar is a simple truth that we Americans often tend to forget. It's that human rights and human responsibilities are inseparable. We often spend a lot of time talking about our rights and our individual freedoms, but we rarely discuss what related responsibilities are created that shape what we owe to other people. For instance, the Church affirms that all people do have a right to private property, but that there's a corresponding responsibility to share it with others in need. Similarly, I have the right to a romantic relationship of my choosing, but this right has a tendency to promote or to produce a lifelong responsibility to raise and care for children as a result. Along the same lines, if you're an employer or a business owner, that's just fantastic, and you have the right to profit off of your hard work. But never forget that a corresponding responsibility exists to make sure that your workers are being cared for and are being fairly compensated. JFK put this really well once. He said, "Our privileges can be no greater than our obligations. The protection of our rights can endure no longer than the performance of our responsibilities." The fourth pillar of Catholic social teaching has come to be known as the preferential option for the poor, a phrase that emerged from Central American Catholicism in the mid-20th century. Its roots go back far deeper, however. Throughout the Old Testament, you'll see examples of God regularly reminding his people to care for the poor in tangible ways. Widows and orphans were to be helped. Fields were to be left partially unharvested so that the poor could eat. And then, with Christ's arrival, God's preference for the poor became strikingly clear. Read the Gospels and just try to keep track of how many times Christ mentions our duties to the poor and the consequences of not fulfilling them. Remember the words he spoke to us. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. This pillar of Catholic social teaching is about how to take those responsibilities Christ was talking about and apply them to our public lives. The good news is that it's really simple in theory. The bad news is that it's actually extremely hard to get society to do in practice. The teaching is this: most of us can currently work to provide for our needs. We should do that. Others currently can't. Those of us who can currently work and provide have a responsibility to provide for those who currently can't until those people are able to work again. Perhaps the reason why that sounds easy in theory, yet is difficult in practice, is that it often requires us to do things that feel a little bit challenging to our base instincts when we really get into it. We're not used to being selfless for long periods of time, are we? For example, we're being asked to think of the needs of the poor every day before our own needs. That is tough to do day in and day out, but it's still what we're being asked to do. Or how about this? We're being asked in some ways to reevaluate the idea of ownership, or who has the right to certain things and why. Think of the case of Jean Valjean in Les Miserables. He steals a loaf of bread to feed his sister's child. They're close to death, and he ends up in prison for 19 years as a result. Catholic social teaching actually implies that not only was it wrong to punish him for this act, but that actually Jean Valjean potentially had a better claim of ownership over that bread than the individual who possessed it beforehand and was not at a risk of dying if they lost it. Now, that's a whole different conversation about the nature of ownership. But the real takeaway here is just that if we're able to work and support ourselves, then God says we have a responsibility to do so. But that if we can't for some reason, well, then we have the right to expect support from others. And that if we're working and see someone else who can't, we have the obligation to support them until they're able to work and support themselves once again. Now, that's a great jumping off point to our fifth pillar of Catholic social teaching, which concerns the dignity, responsibility, and right to work. Some things that Dorothy Day down there fought for. Last time she was arrested, I think she was 75 years old and was protesting for workers' rights. I love that picture of her in her old age, seated in a chair with two police officers with guns right in front of that poor old woman. Well, anyway, the Bible is filled with God calling people to take on tasks. And although Christ might have scolded Martha for working so hard instead of spending extra time with him, Judeo-Christian tradition as a whole is pretty clear on this notion that working is fundamentally important to human life. Papal encyclicals have discussed this at length as well, stating that in work, humans often find a sense of fulfillment and a feeling of purpose. Now, our jobs are not our ultimate purpose. That's getting to heaven. But the jobs can and do give us a sense of meaning and purpose during our time on this earth. Work can fill us with a feeling of dignity. Work can fill us with a feeling of pride. It can also improve our physical and mental well-being unless we work to excess. Most importantly, though, working allows us to make things on our own, participating in God's creative act. A mountain of papal encyclicals haven't been written in Latin just to say that alone, however. There's a lot more that the church teaches about work that has not been said. Not only is work good for us, but so much so that the church says we actually have a right to it. We have a right to jobs. We also, according to the church, have a right to private property as a result. We have a right to be treated respectfully from those who employ us. We have a right to be paid fair wages. And we even have the right to unionize in order to promote and protect those rights as workers. Now, of course, if economic downturn or disability occurs and we can't find work, as we mentioned in the last slide, we also have the right to assistance and to care until we're once again able to find work on our own and get going. The sixth pillar of Catholic social teaching is something known as solidarity, and it's a very simple concept that in some ways sums up much of what we've talked about before. It's the calling to remember that we're all one human family and that we have a duty to actively care for each other. When God asked Cain if he knew where Abel was, Cain replied, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Well, CST answers that question with an unequivocal yes. Yes, yes, and yes. We are each responsible for helping each other person, regardless of whether or not you're talking about your next door neighbor or the victim of an earthquake 7,000 miles away. The Church reminds us that standing up for others and ensuring that their needs are being fully met is often very inconvenient, but it doesn't matter. Remember, that person you see on the nightly news who is being socially oppressed, that person you see struggling to save their farm from a flood, that person you're seeing going hungry or sleeping on a street or fighting for a say in their country's government, all of those people were created in the image and likeness of God too, with infinite value, infinite dignity, and they're worthy of infinite love. We are called to respond appropriately as brothers and sisters of that individual. The seventh and final pillar of Catholic social teaching is one which is getting increased emphasis in recent decades. As it's become clear that humans are having a damaging impact on much of the planet's ecosystem, species counts, pollution, and overall health and well-being, Catholics have been increasingly reminded that we have a sacred duty in this area as well. We did not create the world or its creatures. God did. It is His, and He loaned it to us. We have a responsibility to take care of it, especially because God has loaned Earth to hopefully hundreds of future generations after ours as well. Now that we've explored each of the pillars of Catholic social teaching, I want to thank you for listening to this talk. Christ calls us not only to hear Him, but to follow Him as well. I hope that this guidance put forth by the Church over these past few centuries is helpful in that respect, as we each seek to put faith into practice.